Picture a scene straight out of a Samuel Beckett play or 20th century theater of the absurd. A Gothic cathedral, heavy with the scent of wax and formaldehyde, the crowd holding its breath. Seated on a throne that symbolizes the highest spiritual authority in the Christian world is a dead pope, not metaphorically, literally. This is no ghost of conscience, but the physical body of Pope Formosus, buried 9 months earlier, now exhumed, dressed in papal robes, and propped up on a throne to stand trial. He says nothing. Naturally, he's dead. But the trial is very real. There are charges, witnesses, proceedings, just like in any proper court of law, except that a deacon speaks on the Pope's behalf. Because, needless to say, corpses don't do much public speaking. This isn't medieval dark comedy. It's an official church procedure from the year 897, known to history as the Cadaver Synod, or in Latin, Synodus Horrenda, the horrific synod, a spectacle so grotesque and blasphemous that even contemporaries were stunned. But, as is often the case in history, beneath the outward absurdity lies a deep logic, political, institutional, personal. This trial was the climax of a long drama in which the papal tiara had become more a crown of scheming than a symbol of sanctity. How did the Catholic Church, the supposed moral compass of the Christian world, become the stage for an absurdist play? Why was a pope, already laid to rest, considered so dangerous that he had to be exhumed and judged? And how could this end in anything but disaster for the authority of the Holy See? Before we dive into this madness, a quick reminder. If you enjoy deep, slow-burning stories filled with facts, drama, and a dash of irony, subscribe to the channel. And please let us know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. We're genuinely curious to see how far this story travels. Now then, let's begin. Ahead lies a corpse, an inquisitor, a political war, and a world where even death doesn't guarantee dignity. To understand why Formosus became the first, and so far only pope, to be put on trial after his death, we must explore his biography. Not just his career, but the journey of a man caught at the crossroads of ambition, faith, and geopolitics. Formosus was more than a monk or theologian. He was a diplomat, an intriguer, a strategist, a man who was once excommunicated, then forgiven, then crowned pope, and later dug up and dragged into court. Formosus was born around 816 in Ostia, a coastal city near Rome. That alone gave him an early advantage: proximity to the papal court, access to education, and connections with powerful clerics. He quickly proved himself a capable administrator and missionary. In 864, he was appointed Bishop of Porto, one of the oldest dioceses near Rome. But his real ascent was just beginning. In 866, Pope Nicholas I sent him to Bulgaria. Prince Boris I, who had recently converted his kingdom to Christianity, was looking for a strong church leader to elevate Bulgaria's ecclesiastical status. Formosus impressed the prince so much that Boris asked to have him made Archbishop of Bulgaria. But Rome said no. Canon law forbade a bishop from abandoning his own see. Formosus returned to Italy with a diplomatic victory, but also accusations of ambition and irregular conduct. This made him both popular and dangerous. Charismatic figures never go unnoticed. His main adversary, Pope John VIII, initially kept his distance but soon accused Formosus of conspiracy. In 876, a synod stripped him of his bishopric, banned him from ministry, and excommunicated him. Formosus fled Rome. But the church was no monolith. It was a maze of factions, alliances, and regional powers. Formosus had support from Roman aristocrats and the Frankish nobility. After John VIII's death, he was pardoned and fully reinstated in 879. His star was rising again. In 891, after several short and chaotic papacies, Formosus was elected pope. That's when his most turbulent and influential chapter began. Formosus was not just a pastor. He was a geopolitical actor. The key battleground was Italy, where rival factions backed different claimants to the imperial throne. On one side, Lambert of Spoleto and his father Guy. On the other, Arnulf of Carinthia, a Carolingian from the north. Formosus cautiously but decisively supported Arnulf, placing himself in direct opposition to the powerful Italian party. In 896, Formosus crowned Arnulf as emperor. It was a clear challenge to Lambert. The Pope had thrown his weight behind the north, and for a moment it looked like he'd won. Arnulf entered Rome. The plan was working, until he suddenly fell ill. The campaign collapsed, and a few months later, Formosus died. He was buried with full honors. That should have been the end, but it wasn't. His death marked the start of a new act in the drama. Formosus's enemies didn't just want him dead. They wanted everything he did undone. They aimed to delegitimize his papacy, his appointments, even his memory. When a new pope, Stephen VI, rose to power, he faced a clear task: avenge Lambert, obliterate Formosus's legacy, and do it publicly, theatrically, unmistakably. And so began the planning for the most bizarre episode in Vatican history: the trial of the corpse. If modern politics sometimes feels like theater, the 9th century would prove you wrong. It wasn't theater, it was a gladiator arena. And in that arena, the Pope wasn't the director. He was a pawn, pushed, maneuvered, or removed depending on who was playing. To understand why Formosus ended up on trial post-mortem, we must return to a time when Italy resembled a medieval version of Game of Thrones. After the collapse of Charlemagne's empire, Europe plunged into feudal chaos. Territories fragmented, power shifted constantly, and the imperial crown, while grand in name, meant little without real control. Italy became the key prize. Whoever held Rome and received papal blessing could claim the imperial throne. The Pope, therefore, had enormous symbolic power, but was also a political hostage. Two main camps emerged: Guy of Spoleto and his son Lambert, a powerful Italian dynasty, sought to make the imperial title hereditary. They maintained a firm grip on Rome and wanted the Pope to be their puppet. On the opposing side was Arnulf of Carinthia, a German Carolingian aiming to unite the empire under northern Frankish control. He was supported by some bishops and aristocrats who resented Roman domination and longed for centralized imperial authority. Pope Formosus, as we've seen, tried to balance these forces, but eventually he threw his support behind Arnulf, thereby sealing his fate in the eyes of Lambert's faction. But why was this choice so dramatic? Because in the 9th century, the papacy lacked the untouchable sanctity we often associate with it today. Popes came and went. They were elected, deposed, poisoned, exiled, reinstated. Some didn't last a full year. Their power relied on armed support, and the Roman nobility counted on popes to grant lucrative benefices and bishoprics. This era is often called the Saculum Paparum, the century of popes, marked by rapid turnovers and ecclesiastical violence. The papacy was not a moral compass. It was a battlefield. Further complicating matters was the constant tension between spiritual and secular power. Emperors wanted to influence papal elections. Popes wanted to crown or refuse to crown emperors. Yet both needed each other for legitimacy. Formosus stood at the center of this storm. When he crowned Arnulf emperor, it was not just diplomacy, it was defiance. Arnulf marched into Rome and received the crown. But soon after, he fell gravely ill and his campaign collapsed. Formosus died a few months later. It should have ended there, but it didn't. Stephen VI, the new pope, was fully aligned with Lambert's faction, and Lambert, alongside his mother, the formidable Empress Agiltrude, demanded retribution, not in life, in death. They wanted not only to erase Formosus's influence, but to obliterate his legacy, his decisions, even his memory. What followed was more than a vendetta. It was a ritualistic political purge. Formosus's corpse would be dug up and tried. This was meant to be a display of dominance, a message to any future pope who dared cross the wrong family. In this world, even the dead were instruments of power, and Stephen VI was more than willing to become the shovel and the judge. So this is not merely a tale of macabre courtroom drama. It's a story about institutions that lose all restraint, about authority that decays faster than flesh, and about a fear of the past so deep it drives the living to punish the dead. In January 897, Stephen VI ascended to the papal throne. His pontificate lasted less than a year, yet it left behind one of the most grotesque stains in church history. He was the lead orchestrator of the Cadaver Synod, a trial so absurd it still stuns scholars today. But was he merely a puppet of powerful allies? Or did he carry his own grudge against the dead Formosus? Little is known about Stephen VI's early life. Typical for popes of that era, he was born in Rome, came from a noble background, and became Bishop of Anagni with the support of the influential Spalatin family. That alone is telling. Stephen owed his career to Lambert of Spoleto and his formidable mother, Agiltrude, two power players with a thirst for revenge against Formosus for undermining their rule. After the brief pontificate of Pope Boniface VI, the Spoletan faction essentially controlled Rome and installed Stephen as a loyal and convenient figure. He wasted no time. One of his first acts was to summon a synod, not to debate theology or morality, but to retry the legitimacy of Formosus's papacy, and not metaphorically, literally. He would put the corpse on trial. This wasn't spontaneous madness. It was calculated politics. By annulling Formosus's papacy, Stephen could undo all his appointments and invalidate his decisions. That meant wiping away support for Arnulf of Carinthia, the rival emperor Formosus had crowned, and reaffirming Lambert's legitimacy. At this point, Arnulf was gravely ill and politically weakened. Lambert had returned to Rome in triumph. The time for vengeance had come. Stephen VI might have simply reversed Formosus's decrees. Instead, he chose a theatrical purge. He would dig up the enemy and disgrace him in front of all Christendom. In July 897, the corpse of Formosus was exhumed. According to chroniclers, it was already in an advanced state of decay. Dressed in papal vestments, the body was seated on a throne in the Lateran Basilica. A deacon stood by to speak on its behalf. Stephen reportedly grew increasingly agitated, shouting accusations, tearing at the corpse's garments, and finally ordering the fingers used for blessings to be severed. The charges were technical. Formosus had held the bishopric of Porto while being elected pope, a canonical violation. He had usurped power. He had breached ecclesiastical discipline. But no one was fooled. This was not about canon law. It was revenge and a warning. The synod's verdict was harsh. All acts by Formosus were declared invalid, his papacy annulled, and his corpse thrown into the Tiber River. It was meant to cleanse the church. Instead, it horrified it. Many within the church, including some who had supported Lambert, saw it as sacrilege. The precedent was terrifying. If even a pope could be tried after death, then no one was safe. The sacred authority of the papacy had been shattered. Dissent grew. Within months, a public uprising shook Rome. Stephen VI was arrested, imprisoned, and eventually strangled in his cell. A familiar medieval finale. Irony of ironies? His successor nullified the synod's verdict. Formosus was reburied, this time, hopefully, for good. Summer, 897. Rome is a sweltering city in political trance. Whispers of intrigues, deaths, betrayals, and shifting allegiances linger in the air, and in the heart of Christendom, in the grand Lateran Basilica, clergy, nobles, and onlookers gather for a most bizarre event. This is not a routine church proceeding. Before them sits a corpse, literally. The body of Formosus, buried 9 months earlier, has been exhumed, dressed in tattered papal vestments, and propped up on a throne. His face, sunken and rotting, seems to silently protest the grotesque scene. Behind him stands a deacon, assigned to answer questions on his behalf. What unfolds is not just surreal, it's real official church procedure. Pope Stephen VI presides. His tone is not that of a jurist. It's that of an exorcist or a prosecutor on the edge of hysteria. He shouts accusations, denounces Formosus for usurpation, for violating canon law, for daring to ascend the papacy while still Bishop of Porto. He charges him with unholy ambition, a curious phrase in a court full of political clergy. The corpse says nothing, of course not, but the deacon speaks in his stead, giving monotone replies. The trial proceeds with all the formalities of a court, absurdly performed in the presence of a decaying corpse. The synod lasts several days. Chroniclers don't record every detail, but there are accounts that Stephen, in a frenzy, tore the sacred garments from Formosus' body and ordered the severing of 3 fingers, those used for papal blessings. The body was dragged across the floor, the throne left symbolically empty. The verdict was predictable. Formosus was found guilty. All his acts, appointments, and ordinations were declared null. His papacy was invalidated. His corpse was stripped of honors and thrown into the Tiber River. This was not a trial. It was a ritual annihilation of memory, a medieval damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory, a practice once used by Roman emperors to erase the legacy of enemies, now resurrected under Christian banners and ecclesiastical robes. Reactions were mixed. Some nobles rejoiced. The rival was humiliated. But many in the clergy, especially those ordained by Formosus, were shaken. Would their priesthood be invalidated too? Believers were horrified. Regardless of politics, Formosus had been pope. His body was sacred. The desecration unsettled even hardened loyalists. The church itself was wounded. The Cadaver Synod tore apart what the papacy had long tried to build, its sense of sacredness and permanence. If one pope could desecrate another, who could believe in the infallibility of the office? How could the church claim divine order when corpses were dragged through its basilicas? It created not just scandal, but fear among the clergy, among the faithful, even among Stephen's own allies. And that fear was about to turn on him. Nothing vanishes without a trace, not even a corpse thrown into the Tiber. The Cadaver Synod was meant to be the final note in a revenge opera. Instead, it unleashed a chain reaction that turned against its orchestrators. In the history of the Church, it became not a closure, but a wound. And, ironically, it was the dead Pope who delivered his most powerful sermon. After Formosus's posthumous trial, Rome simmered with quiet outrage. In alleyways and chapels, people whispered, "What next? A trial for St. Peter? A verdict for Augustine?" The clergy were shaken. Many priests, bishops, and abbots had been ordained by Formosus. If his acts were voided, what did that make of their own status? Their ordinations? Their sacraments? Would they too be dug up? The backlash came quickly. In August 897, a full-scale uprising erupted in Rome. Citizens, clergy, and segments of the nobility turned on Pope Stephen VI. He was arrested, thrown into prison, and shortly thereafter strangled in his cell. The vengeance that desecrated the dead had now devoured the living. A new pope, Roman, took the throne and immediately nullified the verdict of the Cadaver Synod. Formosus was posthumously reinstated, but Roman's papacy was brief. He was soon deposed. His successor, Theodore II, reaffirmed Formosus's legitimacy and ordered his body to be recovered from the Tiber and reburied with honor in St. Peter's Basilica. This wasn't just administrative correction, it was a symbolic restoration of order, a desperate attempt to reclaim some of the moral authority the papacy had hemorrhaged under Stephen VI's grotesque trial. Formosus's story didn't rest even then. Years later, Pope Sergius III reversed the reversal, declaring the Cadaver Synod valid once more. Such was the volatility of the 9th century. A pope's legacy could be rewritten as often as the politics demanded. Even the dead weren't safe. The Cadaver Synod marked a turning point. It triggered early efforts to codify canon law, formalize papal authority, and curtail the wild interference that plagued the Church. In time, the Pope would become untouchable, but that untouchability was built in part on the rotting spectacle of Formosus, and the moral, institutions that dishonor their dead don't deserve the trust of the living. Political revenge is acid. It eats through enemies, but it also burns the hands that wield it. And yes, even the dead can speak, not through words, but through the fear they leave behind. We've just explored the tale of Pope Formosus, the man who was put on trial after death. But there are other ways to shatter the dignity of the papacy, not through posthumous verdicts, but through very living flesh, smoldering glances, and hand-delivered invitations to sinful banquets held inside the Vatican itself. Because what's worse for the Church, a dead pope dragged into court, or a living pope wrapped in the arms of a mistress with cardinal sons and private feasts in the Sistine Chapel? If Formosus was judged for being too political, then Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, should have been judged for turning the Vatican into a family business with a hedonistic bonus plan. To understand the scandal that was Pope Alexander VI, we must first understand the man behind the name, Rodrigo Borgia. Born in 1431 in Jativa, near Valencia, in the Kingdom of Aragon, modern-day Spain, Rodrigo came into the world with two great advantages: ambition and an uncle who was already climbing the papal ranks. That uncle, Alfonso de Borgia, would become Pope Calixtus III in 1455, and young Rodrigo would ride his coattails all the way into the upper echelons of the Catholic Church. At age 25, Rodrigo was made a cardinal. He received the vice-chancellorship of the Church, a powerful position that essentially made him the Pope's administrative right hand. It also made him rich, very rich. But Rodrigo wasn't merely bureaucratic. He was strategic, charismatic, and shamelessly pragmatic. He didn't hide his lovers. He fathered children. He hosted banquets and dressed with aristocratic flair. He was a clergyman who understood that Rome was less about salvation and more about survival, and that in the papal court, intrigue was holier than Scripture. Then came the pivotal moment, 1492. Europe remembers the year for Columbus setting sail. The Vatican remembers it for something far steamier. Pope Innocent VIII died, and the conclave of cardinals gathered to elect a new pope. Rodrigo Borgia was ready. The election was a festival of simony, the buying and selling of church offices. Rodrigo, master of deal-making, promised wealth, positions, estates, and favors. He allegedly bought votes like a merchant buying fruit at a market. His main rival, Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, future Pope Julius II, accused him of outright bribery, but he couldn't stop the inevitable. Rodrigo Borgia was elected Pope on August 11, 1492. He took the name Alexander VI. The world had seen corrupt popes before, but Borgia didn't pretend otherwise. He didn't downplay his wealth, his mistresses, or his children. He embraced it all, proudly. From his very first days in power, he transformed the Vatican into a family fortress. He wasn't the vicar of Christ. He was a Renaissance godfather, cloaked in white silk, flanked by cardinals who were also his cousins, sons, or political investments. He saw the church not as a divine body, but as a throne to be guarded, expanded, and passed down like a duchy. But what made Alexander VI so dangerous wasn't just his sins, it was his competence. He was no fool. He was intelligent, cunning, and capable. That made him unstoppable until poison and pride caught up with him. But before the fall came the feast, and no feast in Rome was complete without Vannozza de Catane, his lover, his partner, and the mother of his infamous children. Pope Alexander VI wasn't the first pope to have a mistress, but he was the first to flaunt it so brazenly that even the cardinals didn't know whether they were attending a church council or a Boccaccio novella. In an era where hypocrisy was practically mandatory for the church elite, Rodrigo Borgia stood out for his almost shameless honesty. He didn't hide his lovers, didn't deny his children, and even held family celebrations inside the apostolic palace. Of all his companions, one stood out, Vannozza de Catane. Vannozza was a Roman woman from a respectable, though not noble background, intelligent, attractive, determined. She became not only Borgia's long-term mistress, but his trusted partner. Their relationship lasted over 20 years and produced 4 children, Cesare, Juan, Geoffrey, and Lucrezia, names that would become synonymous with scandal, ambition, and ruthless power. Crucially, Pope Alexander VI publicly acknowledged his children. He granted them titles, arranged high-profile marriages, and positioned them as key players in his dynastic strategy. Cesare became a cardinal at 17, then later a feared military commander. Lucrezia was married 3 times, each union brokered as part of a political alliance. Juan was made Duke of Gandia. These weren't just children. They were the living branches of a Borgia empire. Despite his long relationship with Vannozza, Alexander VI was far from monogamous. Enter a new favorite, Giulia Farnese, a young noblewoman famed for her beauty. Just 15 when she caught the Pope's eye, she soon earned the nickname Julia la Bella, Julia the Beautiful. She was already married, but that didn't stop the Pope from moving her into a palace adjacent to the Vatican. By 1492, Julia had become the de facto First Lady of Rome. People began calling her the Pope's woman. Their relationship was so public that Julia was featured in church frescoes alongside Alexander, and even portrayed as the Virgin Mary in some artworks. Her brother, Alessandro Farnese, quickly rose to the rank of cardinal thanks to her, and would later become Pope himself as Paul III. In the world of Alexander VI, women weren't mere shadows. They were part of official papal politics. Mistresses bore not only children, but also alliances, strategic marriages, and influence that reached across Italy. And the Vatican? It remained silent, or rather, silently partied along with the Borgias. Sacred walls heard the whispers of desire, and the Sistine Chapel echoed not just with prayers, but with the sounds of deals, sealed by kisses, rather than scripture. If the Church was the body of Christ, then under Pope Alexander VI, it began to resemble the body of a crime family don. The Pope didn't merely rule, he ran a clan. The Borgia family, with Rome as its base of operations, functioned like a well-organized mafia, complete with its own financial system, military muscle, diplomatic envoys, and a long list of casualties. At the center of this clan stood Cesare Borgia, first appointed a cardinal at age 17, then, after the mysterious death of his brother Juan, the Pope's favored son, Cesare traded his cassock for armor and became the most feared figure in Italy. Juan disappeared one night and was later found floating in the Tiber with multiple stab wounds. The murder was never solved, but everyone whispered, if it wasn't Cesare, then it was someone with the Pope's blessing. Afterward, Cesare became the Borgia's chief political and military enforcer. He led campaigns across northern Italy, conquered fortresses, punished traitors, and coerced dukes into submission. He wasn't serving the Church, he was building his own state within Italy. The Pope ruled from Rome. His son marched through the provinces, and all of Italy was a chessboard. No less infamous was Lucrezia Borgia. Her name became synonymous with poisoned wine and femme fatale seduction, though modern historians have tried to redeem her as a victim of political marriages. She was married 3 times, each time for diplomatic reasons. Love had nothing to do with it. Her second husband, Alfonso of Aragon, was mysteriously murdered, allegedly at Cesare's command. The motive? Political strategy. His death only strengthened the Borgia grip on power. These family dramas played out amid lavish excess and calculated terror. There were lavish Vatican banquets where dancers stripped before cardinals. The infamous Banquet of Chestnuts, an orgy organized by Cesare in the Apostolic Palace, wasn't whispered legend, but documented by witnesses. The Borgias openly controlled the Vatican's finances. They sold indulgences, bishoprics, even sacred offices. The Church had become a tool for personal enrichment. Those who opposed them lost their positions or their lives. But this wasn't chaos. It was a system. And what's most terrifying, it worked. The Habsburgs, the French, the Neapolitans all negotiated with the Borgias because the family held the keys not just to salvation, but to survival. Alexander VI ruled as the patriarch of a mafia dynasty where family ties overruled canon law, and power was holier than any scripture. Empires may fall, but sins rarely fade. By the end of Pope Alexander VI's reign, little remained of the image of a spiritual father. What was left was a shadow. the shadow of a man who had turned the Vatican into a family estate and the papal throne into a dynastic seat. Between 1499 and 1503, the Borgias reached the height of their power, but cracks were forming. Internal rivalries, Italy's exhaustion with endless wars, and growing hatred for a family that so openly blurred the line between sacred and secular were closing in. In August 1503, Pope Alexander suddenly fell ill. He and Cesare had attended a dinner at a cardinal's palace. Soon after, both showed signs of poisoning. Cesare barely survived. Alexander did not. He died on August 18th. His body began to decompose within hours. Chroniclers described swelling, disfigurement, and a stench that filled the apostolic palace. Some saw it as divine judgment. Others as the final taste of a political life steeped in poison, both literal and metaphorical. His funeral was rushed, discreet, and almost humiliating. His allies quickly vanished. Cesare lost control, and within months, the Borgia dynasty was effectively erased from high politics. The Vatican did its best to erase Alexander's memory. No liturgical mention, no push for sainthood, of course, no statues, no monuments. His legacy had become toxic. Yet, like all great sinners, he didn't disappear. He became a legend. Cesare Borgia became the inspiration for Machiavelli's The Prince. Lucrezia turned into a cultural myth, from venomous femme fatale to tragic duchess. And Alexander himself became a symbol of what happens when a church forgets where ambition ends and service begins. In the 20th century, some historians tried to reframe him as a reformer, a skilled diplomat, a modernizer. But even the most generous assessments can't erase the facts. Under his rule, a moral institution became an engine of control, fear, and personal gain. His death marked not just the end of a life, but of an era. After him, the Vatican slowly veered toward stricter appearances and cleaner reputations. But the shadow of Borgia lingered, not as a model, but as a warning. Thank you for staying with us through this wild, holy, and horrifying journey through papal history. If you enjoy slow, fact-rich stories full of irony, scandal, and unexpected truths, subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments, what stories would you like us to uncover next? A cursed queen? A fake saint? A war over a sausage? We're all ears and eager to dig deep.